Hi. I don't see much of a full book of this, but in my class we have to read The Winterdance by Gary Paulsen, and I thought, hey, I'm just gonna do a full book of it and see if that's helpful for anyone. Hopefully it is. It's a really good book. And there's prelude, beginnings, dogs from hell, major Rex, dogs, beginnings, becoming dog, first snow, Alaska, the race, pre-race, Ingle River, I can't say that word, Finger Lake, Rainy Pass, a bunch more. You can read it there if you would like. And I'm gonna start on prelude, where it starts, and I'm gonna go down reading every single chapter. Hope that helps. And you can read along. I have a bit of a stutter, just saying. But I'm gonna read the whole thing. Hopefully that helps. Prelude. The storm broke with a sudden viciousness that startled and frightened me. I had left camp with 8 dogs and a slightly loaded sled just after midnight. They were my problem dogs. In all teams, there were good dogs, some not so good dogs. And then there were problem dogs. Dogs that might be a bit young, or like to fight too much, or spend too much time looking back to see the sled driver, what was the sled driver doing. They required extra effort. The problem dogs, more time to understand, time to know, time to learn how they think and act and work. So, once every 4 days or so, I would harness the problem dogs and head up to the mountain and try to learn from them and about them. We were in Alaska to train 3 months before the second Iditarod race, and I would learn as much as the dogs. The difficulty became because of a headache. Simple things, small things can change lives. My winter cap had fallen into the fire and burned. I bought a new one, but it had more bulk, thicker weave. When I left camp, I put my battery pack on my waist and the band for the headlamp around my head and over my cap, so a light would be centered on my forehead. It was too thick because the hat was more bulky. The band was adjusted as far out as it would go, and to fix it I would have to sew on a piece of cloth to extend it. But the dogs were already harnessed and hooked in a gang line and screaming to run in the high-pitched neighing shrill that deemed hurry. So without changing the headband, I stood to the sled and unhooked from the birch tree that held it. They ran well at first, excited by the run. I left camp and headed north and east, up into the mountains that marked the end of Alaska range. As the trail steeped, the snow grew more powdery with altitude. The dogs showed the settled in for a long haul over the past. An hour passed, ruffling along in the dog's breath, the runners sighing. Everything with the dogs, with the country, with the life, with each breath. Everything was beautiful. But I couldn't see it. I was in agony. My head was throbbing from the tight band on the headlamp. And I wasn't seeing beauty, dogs, sled, country, any of it. The Chinese have a proverb that says a man with a toothache cannot be a love, and that concept was very much driving me. My temples ached, and the pain worked around my head, wrapping my thinking to keep me not only from enjoying the run, but from watching warning signs, paying attention to the dogs. And when I finally started to see things, it was too late by far. They tried, the dogs, the trees, the wind. When I stopped to check the dog's feet and work in ointment, a big white slide dog named Cracker started fidgeting, smelling a breeze that was now and then gusting into wind. I didn't understand it. I didn't see it for the warning it was. Flakes of snow, not large and fluffy, but small and mean, driven, started to appear. They were signs of weather coming, as was Cracker's restlessness. He hated storms and liked to be well holded up before they hit. But I ignored the snow as well, finished working on their feet, and called the dogs up as soon as I'd finished. I had in mind finishing the run, making some kind of loop, 80 or 90 miles, and getting done with it, and back into the camp and comfort where I could sew a new band for my headlamp. Or the gosh dang headlamp, as I was beginning to think of it. And I had, in my misdirected forcing on my small problem, completely forgotten some of the basic tenets of running dogs. The most important, your home is where you are with your team. The sled. You cannot outrun weather. Or as I heard on Monsieur says, you've got to dance with even when the music sucks. The music was soaring. The wind was increasingly, exponentially, and had lacked purpose for time. Time wallowed this way, was that, but now it had direction and some force. and the sleet was increasing as well, not completely obscuring vision yet. I could still see the team pretty well. The yellowish white spot of the headlamp, but definitely more than it had been. Another warning. Sorry. And still, and ignored the worst, far worst. By ignoring it, I did things to compound the errors. I went through the tight stand of dense spirits. They were set thickly and blocked the wind completely, and some of them were dead and would make a wonderful firewood. I could have stopped here and tipped the sled and pulled the trap over the top of the nearby perfect shelter. Could have made a fire on the mount with wood enough to last a week, all within the easy reach. Could have laid out a foam pad, pulled a few dogs inside with me, and ridden out the storm in complete comfort. I had 4 cans of beef stew and 45 pounds of meat for the dogs, and we could have lived well even with storm rationings. Could have. Instead, my head was getting pinched and passed through the trees without noticing them, or at least without thinking of what they could have mean to me and the dogs. Shelter, warmth, hope, life. At the end of the stand, the trail left timberline and had into the snowfields of high country. In truth, there wasn't much of a trail, more just a line, or more even often to no mark at all in the snow, and I was depending on the lead dogs. The lead dog, a tiny female named Durberry, to find the way. She was good at it, sometimes going by feeling as she trotted, quick and alert. Her little black and white form tugged out front like a beacon. Just as the trail left the trees, it moved into the shallow depression and went along the side of the mountain for 2 miles or so, angled so that I had to stand on one runner and pull the sled over at an angle to keep it from sliding down the mountain. This put Parka back into the wind, and that coupled with a beginning in the depression and having the headache made me not notice further warnings. The wind was much stronger now, straight in a line, and with no edgings, getting forced with somewhere, going to going to somewhere, reaching the point where small things would start to become very, very important. Little ignorance, small silliness, a loose bolt, a dropped mitten could cripple, could kill. At the end of the depression, the trail moved out into the portal open, still slightly around the side of the mountain, but where could not be moved, be no shelter, and anybody except a couple idiots would know the severeness of the wind, the storm. But I hulked with my back to it all, my head thunking away, staring down at the runner next to me, while I stood on the other side and wished to heck I had taken time to make a headband longer for another mile, then another, 7, 8 miles out, the snowfields above timberline, away from shelter, away from heat and comfort, away from rest, and into the madness. I had turned 3/4 away from the wind, not just back to it, but looking to the near, down the trail, half bemused that our tracks were blowing and filling before the sled had gone 8 feet, which was about as far as I could see in the blowing snow and had wind. Here some survival code kicked in, some nudging in my thoughts that if we tracks were filling the fast, the wind must be getting worse. Right then, Durberry took the team out into the side of the mountain, and it was like passing around the end of the wall. Durberry simply vanishing. I had swung around to look forward as we came out into the true open, just in time to see a crunching cloud of white hitting her from the side of a bulldozer. For an instant, I thought she was merely obscured by the snow, and squinted, trying to see through the rolling mass of this sudden shrieking wind. But it was impossible. She was gone, blown away into the side, and in a heartbeat the sled and the rest of the team were carried by the mountain into the roar and were gone as well. I snatched with my hand as the wind hit, but it was too sudden, too wild, and I was torn from the sled, taken by the wind, tumbling end over end down the mountain. Velocities, technical terms are meaning. I knew a man who tried to make a winter ascent of Mount Denali McKinley, who was blown off the mountain, lost and dead and gone, and the body never found. And some estimated that the wild had to be 150, 200 miles in an hour to carry a human body sideways off a mountain. I do not know how fast the wind was blowing. I had never included the typhoons in the Philippines been in anything remotely like the force that took me now. I had literally no control over my life. It simply blew me sideways from the sled. I tried to hook my elbow in a handlebar, but I missed. And a glimpse of the sled swinging like the winter vine hanging downwind from the team, and then nothing. I tried to stand, but the wind kept me knocking down, tumbling me end down the mountain. I would try to grab hold, but there was nothing to catch, and I just kept rolling and bouncing. I'm not sure how long it lasted. I was completely disoriented. Had only a biggest idea of up and down, and could see nothing, hear nothing but screams in the wind. It could have blown me anywhere it wanted, blown me to heck, blown me off the world, and I wouldn't have known it. Instead, it fetched me against a rocky outcropping over with ice. I hit with a thump that knocked the air out of my lungs, burying my head in a mountain of snow. I hung there for a few seconds, perhaps a half minute, held by pressure in the wind pushing me against the ice and rock, and thinking started to come back in jerks. Dogs! The dogs! Where were the dogs? Were they all right? Dearberry! I tried to call out, yell her name, but the wind tore it away. I was still on my side, half raised, and I used my mittened hands to claw to hold the rocks while I edged along the side, searching for a place was out of blast, inches at a time. Once my foot seemed to hang out, jerked it back down. Slingered a bit and came around beneath the slight overhang. and for the time caught my breath. I felt as if I might be able to hold the position. It was, I thought, the ways people died. What I was doing. Little things, small things, kill. I was partly out of wind, but I had no gear apart from my clothing, no food, no fuel, no anything. It happened just this way. Caught in wind, cold, blowing snow, confused enough to forget life, and death came. Winds high, country sometimes lasted days, weeks, and locked in life. Caught in the back of the small rock, face lost. There were moments of self-pity and anger and how stupid I had become. To compound my problems, my batteries were going down fast. My headlamp was very dim. The fresh batteries on the bag on the sled, but then instincts took over. I had tried to make the best of what I had. The slight yellow glow, eddying snow, dimmed by the wind as it came over the rock. I saw that the opening went back in slightly, a foot and a half. Beneath the hangover, the hole was filled with hard-packed snow, and I started digging, making almost an impression in the frozen snow when I felt a presence. That this had happened before. The hallucinating, and it was all in my mind. In truth, I was tired and not thinking straight. And I looked around once and then decided it was just that. My dreams catching up with me again. I ignored it. But feeling persistent, something was there. Was close. Something or someone, and I couldn't ignore it. I stopped digging and tried to see the wall of snow, the wind, but I couldn't see anything yet. I felt it, a stretch just moved away from the shelter in a tiny distance. Insane. To leave the shelter. Ooh. Insane. To leave the shelter. If anything, the wind was getting worse. And if I moved into the open, it would take me again, sweep me away. Yet I couldn't resist the pull. It was there. Something close. I knew it was absolutely. And I scrambled around on my stomach, pulled away from the shelter a few inches, a foot, hung on the edge of the wind with my left hand and the toe of my left foot dug into the ground, into the snow. to hold me, teetering there, and was about to give up when I saw it. A simple shape, a triangle shape in the snow, sitting there, wombling and waving in the wind. The sled, sitting upright, taking a full force of the storm and not moving. The sled was there in front of me, not 4 feet away, and simply not 4 feet away. It simply couldn't be there. Should have been blown for miles, but it sat there, was waiting for me to ride. For a second I couldn't believe it. Laws of physics were being changed. A gosh dang tank wouldn't have been able to sit there in that wind. Yet it was there. And I crawled on my stomach until I could touch the end of the runner to convince myself it was real. And when I was close, I saw what had happened. Luck. All luck. As the sled tumbled in the snow hook. The sharp anchor tied into the gangline to hold the dogs and the sled is stopped, had bounced out of the leather carrying pouch and dragged along the snow. It was the kind of hook that is self-burying, like an anchor on a boat, biting deeper and harder. It is pulled. But it had not set in the snow. Instead, it had skittered along in some way until it came into the rocks, and then in a small crack it captured both sides of the hook. The team was there, all well. I couldn't see them, but they were still tied to the sled, shrugged down the mountain with the wind pulling at them. And I had been given life where there was almost no hope. But to live, to make it work, I would have to leave the shelter, to work down the team and bring them back up to the rock, and all the while I would be dement on the hook holding. If it popped loose, it would all start over. The wind would own us, and we would be gone once more, and there couldn't be the kind of luck again that would catch the hook just where it needed to catch. I lay there at the rope and the hook, trying to think of the risk, the gamble the thinking of others that were important, and I knew it wasn't me. It wasn't me just anymore. It was us. I could take the pad and sleeping bag and food out to the sled and drag them into the hole and make shelter and live through it. I would be all right. I would even perhaps be comfortable. But the dogs were out there, out in it, out in the wind, and with their backs to the wind, would blow their hairs open, drive snow and sleet down into their hair and closer in their bodies, and their body temperatures would go down. It had happened. It had been told by other dog drivers if their body temperatures were down, they could start building fluids in their lungs, getting ammonia. It could kill them. They might get me home, but they might die even then. And there came a moment, lying in my stomach, looking at the hook I was holding in place. My hand in the faint glow, dying glow from my dying headlamp, came the moment when I knew I couldn't allow that. In some way, we had gone past where that could be allowed, gone past where it could have lived with myself, gone into the area where it had become we instead of I. For another minute, my body rumbled. Everything in me fought against getting up, depending on that the team would pull them back in with me. It was not that sensible act. But it happened. My legs moved, pushing me half up. Still, almost against my will, I hammered at the hook with both of my hands, trying to point deeper in the crack. Grabbed the sled and moved out into the wind. It had, if anything, increased my vicinity. It worked inside my parka hood, seemed to poke at my eyelids and drive snow under them and tore me loose. Once more drove me down along the gangline, catched at the main rope, and moved through the dogs. As I moved through the dogs, who were in an unholy mess, they had tumbled in the wind themselves, blown ahead in the wind and had tangled and retangled until some of them were upside down, with all 4 feet caught in their tugs. I worked dog to dog, going by feel. My light was gone now, not even the glow, but I had harnessed harnessed enough to know how the ropes and tugs and necklaces should feel by the touch. As I untangled each dog, it stood, it back to the wind, and waited the last I came to Dearberry. The only one not tangled. She was curled in a small ball in the snow and reluctant to get up. But I pulled her collar and started up the slope, dragging her with me. Crawling heavily into the last, I was back in the small shelter of the overhang with her. Durberry's tug hooked back into the gangline, and she had been pulling the other dogs back and around and up with her. I put her to the side, and she kept pulling, putting each dog down next to her as they came to me until we were all there, crammed in the small space. There were demoralized by the wind, and two started to fight, which triggered more fights. I had cursed and screamed and cuffed until they reluctantly quiet once again. Then I grabbed the main gangline and pulled nose of the sled back around and to me, all still in the dark, and tripped it on its side to the body of the sled would block some wind coming in the edge of the rock. We now had started of shelter, the rock making the biggest wall, the sled stopping the eddies on the upwind corner, the dogs forming a rest on the downside. I zipped up the sled bag and took my sleeping bag and formed a padding, pulling them under me. Then tucked myself in the sleeping bag and pulled the dogs around me and on top of me until I was covered in living mass of fur. Of course, they would not all fit in the jammed the ones I could on top of me and hung in and huddled in. They were at least out of the wind and comfortable on the sleeping bag, and formed a pad and we settled to ride out the storm. All of this took less than a half an hour to reaching the weather and the wind, and I had not actually tried to think things through in the shelter with the dogs on top of me. I started to think and realize that if the storm had lasted for a long time, nobody would come looking for me for 2 or 3 days. If then, and that if there was a solution to my problems, if needed, I had a problem. It would have to become from me, from the dogs and me. I was alone. Always in my life there had been something else, someone else. There had been bad times, rough times, and there had somehow always been been other people, but not now. But it was at the very first frightening, and then a secondary feeling came. The kindness of liberation that I did not understand. It made no sense. I was in a snow shelter in Alaska range in the middle of the worst storm I have ever seen, with no possible chance of external help, and I felt liberated. The dogs rested for a time, but they were not tired, and being jammed one on another when it was not time to rest or stop made them uneasy. They have defined likes and dislikes, and will often hate each other, especially females, for no apparent good reason. Jamming them in one on another, tangled them is sometimes dangerous when they aren't tired. They settled to fidget and fight, and within moments my clothes were torn. I was bleeding where I had been bitten. I bellowed at them and swore, and they settled again. It was uneasy growls and at each other. I returned to my thoughts. I decided the reason I felt liberated was there is a kind of freedom of being alone. It was true, I could die. The dogs could die. We had food for 3 days, and maybe I could run another 4 or 5 days with no food. But if the storm dropped several feet of snow and it was soft, I would have to move in front of the dogs on snowshoes and make a trail, and it would have to be much work for too long. 800 miles at best, a mile or an hour, maybe half a mile in an hour, breaking trail. Math while covered in dogs in a snow shelter waiting out the storm. If you broke a trail with snowshoes, half a mile an hour, and it was 80 miles to camp, where there was food for the dogs. It would take 160 hours. Cook of Antarctica who was a fool and didn't feel living in dogs, died 11 miles from his food. The dogs moved and scrambled again and growled at them. And I growled at them. I was starting to growl more at them and less talk, speaking in grunts. So if I took 160 hours as a normal hours in normal weather, what other storm came up while you were trying to get back? What would it take if two trains left Chicago and there were storms in their lead dogs developed bad feet and they simply could not move, and there was no food? It was still too soon in my dog's career for me to begin to go mad while running them. That would come later. But the entail, perhaps, of the madness, the force, and primitive sharpness, the instincts were there. And then when the time became long breaths long beneath the dogs. Hours after hour, the storm had not stopped. My thinking began to roll by itself, tumbling, and after tumbling and falling until the heat of the dogs and my bag caught up with the strain and tiredness, and I slept. I'm not sure how long I slept, entailing the light and the dogs kept hastening, but soon I went into deep REM sleep. I was aware of nothing until I felt pain in my eyes. A sharp deafened like needles, and I awakened into a thin, sharp of flashbulb bright white light drilled directly into my eyes through the hole beneath Durberry, who was on my head. The dog named Walter, who was across my chest and lower chin. I moved my head and shoulder, and the dogs felt me and yawned and stretched on top of me, and then stood and shook. I saw the world through a shower of snow and drifted and heaped on top of the dogs. I had not shown much, but had blown deep drifts here and there, and I sat up and saw the outcropping where we sheltered was between two drifts 10 or so feet high. I zipped the bag and stood and saw for the first time the daylight where I was. It was dazzling. Before, above, and out into the northwest lay the whole Alaska range. It's possible to live a month below significantly, and the range, and never seen them through the clouds. But there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and the peaks looked like they were right on top of me. It was still, not the breath of wind, and deeply intense cold, 45, perhaps 50 below. I shook snow out of the bag and zipped it and rolled it. Then I flipped the sled up and knocked the snow off the cloth sled bag and a stove cooker inside, and decided, since the weather was clear and looked to stay clear for a while, I could take time to cook food and feed the dogs. I pulled the food bag and the stove, and soon had a 5-gallon aluminum cooker melting snow and heating meat chunks for the dogs. I fed them a lined them out of the snow and untangled them and rehooked those that had hooked the sled, and then took just exactly how close I had them. 2 things, both possibly fatal. The hook, which I had deepened on when I made my way down the dogs to drag them back into the shelter. The hook had popped and hung by only the tiny corner of the rock, caught on the very tip on the left hook prong. It rumbled there, barely caught, and as I reached down for a moment, of my hand brushing loosened the rest of the way, and the hook fell again away. It had been that close when I went to get the dogs, that fragile and dreamed Threed had held me. And when I stood to the sled, and called the team up, started to work back the way we had come, squinting because I hadn't brought sunglasses. I saw what would have had happened had I hooked came loose. Blow us where the wind would have driven us lay a huge cannon. The wind had been blowing us toward the cannon wall, which dropped several hundred feet near vertically to the frozen river. I could not have survived the fall within serious damage, and any damage would have been fatal. Laying in the bottom of the cannon broke the dogs gone was well. None of us would have made it. The hook had blown the team down until they hung on the gangline, still attached by the hook. The hook had caught with a dewberry not 50 feet from the edge of the cannon wall. Taking into account of the drift that hung out of the edge. Now she was almost on top when the hook stopped her. All luck. Everything had been done wrong, not fixing the headband of the lamp and replacing batteries, not stopping where I should have stopped, moving into the unknown territory. In bad weather, all stupid mistakes. Mistakes had injured and killed people, and luck had kicked and saved us. The snow was indolently deep, expect in the drifts, and we could move around those. I let them run until they settled and immersed myself in the run and the beauty of the mountains. We were high enough to see almost the country back down to the willow and Anchorage spread out like a impossibly beautiful map below us. The dogs were running as well, shoulders driving all the tugs tight, and the eminence of the wind made the night before seem like a bad dream. It and did not hit me until later, much later. We finished the run and the dogs were tied back in camp, sleeping on straw, and I was sitting with a friend, sipping tea, looking at the fire, cooking a 50-gallon barrel full of dog meat and mush. The heat from the fire made my face seem to burn, and raised a cup of tea, and my hands were shaking. Cold? Cold? Cold. No, how do you make that voice? Cold. Cold. My friend asked. I put the cup down, but kept staring into the fire. No, scared. Scared of what? I had told him some of what had happened, but not how close it had been. Not how the hook looked hanging by one prong. Not how the canyon yawned away forever down and down, and how the wind blew, and how really gosh dang close it had been. All of it rushed in now, and I looked at the tea, thinking I would take a drink in a minute. When the shaking had subsided a bit, just scared, life and all. And because he had been in the military, it seemed it and seemed and done those things and lived long enough to know he did not ask more. He nodded, and we sat staring into the fire, and I thought that any sane man who was in the Florence and had a good career growing could quite now would leave the dogs, end it now, and go back to the world and sanity. And I knew what scared me wasn't the canyon, and it wasn't the hook hanging by one prong, but the knowledge, the absolute fundamental knowledge that I could not stop. I would not stop. I would never be able to stop running the dogs of my own free will. That is the end of Prelude. And then there's the dogs. And then there's beginnings. I'm going to make another video on beginnings. Chapter 1, that chapter, beginnings, and Dogs of Hell on the same. But this is becoming an hour long, and I need to have dinner soon, so I will start that later. But hopefully this was helpful. That chapter was Prelude. I will get on to I'll get on to beginnings. I know there's not any audios of beginnings, so beginnings will be on my page. Don't worry. Okay. That is all for today. Hope you have a great day.